Japan. And today we are talking about Japanese politics, something that we don't often talk about on the show, but of course it is very relevant for sustainability in terms of keeping better quality of life for people and value of planet in balance with profits. Governance is such an important part. And today we have an expert on Japanese politics and elections, Donna Weeks. Thank you so much for joining all the way from Brisbane today. Oh, I can't hear you. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm getting a little bit of feedback from you at the moment. I don't know what that is.
Okay, maybe if you turn down your speaker, then you might get a bit less.
Yeah.
Can you still hear me?
See. Yeah, I'm just getting it on repeat, but anyway, not to worry.
Okay, I don't hear that on our side. It sounds good. So
yep.
Let's
okay. All right, I'll try and work through it.
All right. Well, Donna, you've had such a long and interesting career in Japanese politics. You were teaching for a long time at a Tokyo University about political science and peace studies. You're now back in Brisbane, but you're still very much in the loop of what's happening in Japanese elections. How did you get interested and invested in spending so much time on Japanese politics? Where did that come from?
Yeah, it's really good. I still have that delay happening, so I'll try and juggle that. So we've got a 15-second delay going as well. Look, it's actually 40 years since I first went to Japan, went to Tokyo as an exchange student from my university. At the time, Japanese, the economy was quite strong here in Australia, and a lot of students were studying Japanese, and a lot of my friends were studying Japanese and economics. And I thought, well, actually, to be honest, my political science lecturers were more interesting, so I went towards politics. And so my exchange opportunity then was to actually study within the political science department at the university, and it really took off from there. I had some wonderful lecturers who took me under their wing and really taught me really a bit of what we're going to talk about today, the factionalism of the LDP, how it works. And I really just got interested in, on the one hand, the economy is important, but I guess for a lot of us, we've got to understand how all the pieces fall into place. As you were saying in the introduction, how do we make those pieces fall into place to make a better society? And it's not just the economy, as we so often hear, but it's the politics, the interplay, the power relationships that I came to learn were quite important. And so that's where I started, and that's what I've really been doing backwards and forwards over the last now 40 years. I hate to think of it like that, but yeah, it's 40 years.
Wow, incredible. And I'm sure you've seen so many changes over the years since then. Now, today we're going to talk about the top 7 candidates who are very likely to be at the top of the ticket for the president of the LDP, who will, because the LDP is empowered, they will become the prime minister. But let's talk about Kishida, Prime Minister Kishida, a little bit, because he is stepping down, and it was kind of a sudden decision. It sounds like there was a lot of kind of conflict within the party. There was things about not declaring how much donations you were getting during the elections, and other kind of scandals were happening. He has, in my terms, he's been a great prime minister. He is from Hiroshima. He came back and did the G7 here. He seems to have a very good international collaboration level. But in terms of Japan, there's a lot of resentment against the party and him in particular. And I think stepping down was a way to kind of diffuse that, maybe. What's your take on that?
Yeah, look, clearly I think at one level the pressure of trying to balance what he wants to do with the economy, what he wants to do with international relations, came up against this constant, opinion polling that had his popularity down, the LDP taking hits all over the place because of the money scandals. And I guess one reason why I've stepped back a little bit from the nitty-gritty of the factional and numbers aspects of politics. I want to step back a little and understand this in a broader picture. And I guess things like opinion polls that have become so much a part of our politics wherever we are. It's the same here in Australia. It kind of turns politics into a kind of a horse race approach, you know, who's ahead, who's winning, and so on. And I think that's not a good way for us to deal with our politics. You know, we've got to dig much more deeply into what policies they're about. What are their philosophies? What kind of society do the politicians want to drive ahead? And what kind of society do we want? So for me, I think we've had this tendency over the last several decades now to have our politics determined by opinion polls. And in a way, this is what's happened with Kishida. So I'd say that's the first thing. He's probably just, well, without this popularity, without opinion polls going up, what chance do we have? So in one way, maybe he stood down thinking it's in the best interests of the party, let's just say. Now, when Kishida came into power, 3 years ago, I think it was a little bit of a surprise, to be honest, but it was only the fact that Abe's factional numbers got behind him to put him into the position. And I think after the Abe era, which for a lot of us who want a gentler society, a less militaristic society, shall we say, I think there was some hope that with Kishida, with, as you say, his background from Hiroshima, his very strong anti-nuclear weapon stance coming from that Hiroshima experience, the fact that for some of us his factional lineage goes back to Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato as well. And he was seen, I suppose, as at some level as being a bit softer, not as hard line as perhaps some of the other candidates. I think at that point there was some anticipation, and he brought in a new capitalism idea for his economy, for the economy. You know, again going back to his Ikeda lineage, there was some hope and anticipation that, well, actually maybe Japan's just going to come back a little bit more to the midstream. Now, that really did change dramatically with the shooting of Abe, and I was really interested to see almost the change in Kishida's demeanour as a result. Obviously, it's a huge thing for all of us to deal with, but the fact that I think that changed Kishida, it brought him out to say, well, I've got to carry on the Abe legacy, which meant he had to go quite a distance, quite in a different direction from where he'd come from, what he was saying. And I think from watching him over the last 3 years, he's tried to straddle that from Hiroshima. I have an anti-nuclear platform I want to pursue. I want to keep this Ikeda legacy going, but also now seeing where Japan has to go and the build-up of the defence and so on. It really, I guess, saw him have to really struggle, I think, with these two aspects. And I guess in the end, he was unable to really do either of them well enough because he was divided on two aspects he could have pursued.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. But also in Japanese politics, we might see him come back. We saw some prime ministers make returns, right? Come back in power. It might not be the end, and surely he will have some sway inside the party as well. What do you think? Yeah.
Certainly.
Should we talk a little bit about who looks like to be the 7 possible candidates for the next president of the LDP? And then that would automatically become who is going to be the prime minister, right? Let's talk about some of the more obvious candidates first. Taro Kono, can you give us a little insight into his political
stance?
Yeah.
Look, and I'll qualify this by saying we still don't know who is going to stand as yet. There's still the formality of getting they have to get their 20, endorsed by 20 members of the parliament. That is still a few days away before they formally announce. So like everyone, we're sort of speculating here, and I guess my role as a political scientist, I don't like to speculate too much. We like to look back and make judgments rather than go forward and speculate too much. But look, there's certainly some names there that I think will be on the list come the end of the week. Kono is one of them, and you know, I'm at that stage in my life where I was studying politics when his father was in politics, you know, same as Abe's father was foreign minister. And so I'm going through this whole generational issue with a lot of these contestants. Look, Kono has a kind of a popularity with the public, I guess. He's a little bit quirky, he's a little bit different. I see recently on social media platforms, people are saying, why are you blocking us? You know, shouldn't you be, you know, allowing us as a public, you know, you're a public figure, we should be able to do this.
Donna, can while you're speaking, maybe just turn off your speaker and see if that helps. And then when you're done speaking, you can turn it back on. Yeah, try. Now we don't have any audio. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Let's go back to what we had.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's good. That's all right? All right.
Yep.
Okay,
Perfect.
we'll try that.
Okay.
I can't hear you.
But, oh, okay. Nope.
We'll see how we go. All right. So Kono, you know, he's been entrusted with trying to, as we know, digitize Japan, bring Japan into a greater digital sort of aspect. He's sort of succeeded in some levels, but not other levels. I mean, it's kind of tricky to see where that's going to go. He's probably of the candidates, because of his background, probably the most fluent in English, which some people would say is an important thing to have in a prime minister. Kishida certainly could engage with on the international stage in English. So there's that aspect that he likes to bring forward. He's a much more of a hawk in terms of defence than his father ever was. There is that side of it as well. He would give himself a good chance because he would think he is popular, but whether he can draw that popularity from where he needs the votes is another thing.
Yeah. Also, let's talk about age a little bit, because one of the things that LDP is saying, a lot of their polls are showing, is that people, even within the party, they really want a new, young, fresh perspective. Now, Kono is 61, which is one of the younger of the 7 candidates. But we do have 2 that we're going to talk about later who are in their 40s still. So that's an interesting shift in the election this time, don't you think?
The young side, my 4th year dissertation was about a group of young Turks from the LDP at the time who said, we don't need factions, we can, you know, we're young, we want this different approach to politics. So that's 40 years down the track, and in a way nothing's changed. You know, we've certainly got a couple in that category this time. Koizumi, let's talk about him because he's quite popular with the public because his father was a popular prime minister for all different reasons. Now, what Koizumi Sr. did as prime minister, you know, was not considered the best in some ways. He tried, you know, privatizing, taking kind of a Thatcherite approach to, if you like, a kind of a neoliberal approach. Koizumi Sr., however, in more recent times has become a really strong anti-nuclear advocate, and you know, there's some real contentions there with his former LDP. So I mean, it's going to be again an interesting tension between Koizumi Senior and his son, should he become prime minister. It certainly does have popularity, to go back to those opinion polls, some popularity in trying to draw the public's popularity. That could be a factor, you know, if they want to win the next election. I guess his youth, his age, gives him a sense amongst people that he's being younger. I know he's an advocate of separate names for married couples, which is quite an issue at the moment. When people marry, women by and large have to take their husband's surname. He's recently come out to say that he's, you know, his stint as environment minister got him some international coverage. But people see him as being the son of, and that's not always the same as Kono Taro, as it happens. You know, this generational aspect of LDP politics at the moment, I think, is sort of annoying people a little bit. The other young contender, shall we say, Kobayashi, has come up. He's got quite a profile. Again, basically on his youth, and I'm not sure that that's actually going to capture the factional numbers that they need at this stage to get the presidency and ipso facto the prime minister. So Kobayashi is coming again from that idea that we need to take Japan forward again on an economic platform, and of course cost of living wherever we are is really what's affecting a lot of people. So that's where most people's ears will be, but whether he will ultimately bring the numbers together is, you know, a lot of politicians at this stage, some of these younger ones aren't thinking about becoming prime minister this time, but they're putting their hat in the ring to get noticed for next time or the time after, given that these elections roll around every 2 or 3 years. So it could be just a strategy in that sense too.
It's really interesting, isn't it, to see, and of course, to have this idea that it's future campaigning. It's not just maybe it would be an outside chance to get the bid this time, but it's good branding for the future bid. One thing that stood out for me, Kobayashi is turning 50 this year. You mentioned Koizumi as one of the like outside favorites. He's launching his official YouTube channel this Friday. He's officially getting in the race this Friday as well. He's 43, but according to some polls, he has so much support, almost 30% of support. Maybe because of that family legacy as well, which I thought was really interesting. One thing about these two, Kobayashi and Koizumi, they both have education in America, like a lot of the top LDP do. Koizumi went to Columbia and studied political science. Kobayashi, he was at Harvard, I believe, Harvard Graduate School of Kennedy School of Government, which seems a popular one with top government in Japan. How does that reflect on Japanese universities? I'm not sure.
Well, if we start talking about universities, we'll go down.
Yeah, that's a different time.
And look, it's interesting. Kono also spent time, did his degree in Georgetown, I think, in Washington. So, yes, there is a sense, I guess, that sense amongst the Japanese public that their politicians, if they've had that, well, we call it international experience, but it's by and large experience in the United States, that makes them an international person. It makes them somewhat special. And I guess, given that the Japan-US relationship is at the moment possibly one of the most critical, then it's important to think about how will the Japanese Prime Minister, whoever he, or let's be optimistic and hope she in the future, might be. I guess it's how they were going to work with, say, the next president of the United States. And of course, a lot of what's happening now, we can't think of it in isolation. We can't think of it without thinking about what's going on in the United States at the moment. Trump remains popular as a candidate, amongst his people. And of course, we know that in Japan there's a strong support for Trump as well, which may figure into the factional. In a way, if this election, this presidential election was coming after the United States election, we'd have a better sense of where the calculations are. But given that coming up as it is in September for the LDP leader, factoring in how they'll deal with either a Harris or a Trump administration, I think will inevitably play a part as well. So someone who can work with and deal with the United States is going to be important. And I know we haven't got to her yet, but Kamikawa Yoko, who is also a likely candidate, she's a current foreign minister. She's been, working quite well on the international stage. Her, her stint as Minister for Justice a few years ago, was awkward and difficult and so has its problems. And notwithstanding, she's still a woman in the LDP. She is able to speak quite fluently and engage quite well on the international stage as well. It does come back to that question of whether or not Japan is, the LDP is going to be ready for a female leader, which, given the factional alliances at the moment, it's probably still a little bit too soon for that. The women will have to be head of their own factions before I think they can get the numbers as the system stands at the moment, unfortunately.
Well, it was interesting to research a little bit about her. She's 70, which is one of the older candidates, actually, of the group that's in the running right now. We haven't talked about Toshimitsu Motegi and Shigeru Ishiba yet, but they're in their late 60s. So she's actually the eldest of the seven, it looks like. But she was part of the gender equality group back in the past. She's been in 3 different cabinets, Abe, Suga, as well as Kishida. So she's shown that she has political prowess. She has a lot of support within the party. But, when you look at, I don't know, this struck me as interesting, that her hobbies are Ragio Taiso and doing ground golf and Nihon Buyo. And then you look at the younger candidates and they're doing marathon and they're young parents. That really stands out. If you're trying to signal that you've got a fresh approach as a party, it's harder to choose an older candidate, even though, of course, choosing a woman would be very radical and very new for Japan. But yeah, the question in America right now is America ready for a woman president? And I think with the rise of Harris Walz, we're seeing, yes, they're ready. I don't know about Japan, though. Japan, in many ways, seems to be a bit behind. Can you touch on this a little bit for the Tokyo governor's race? Because that was a big issue. And of course, a woman did win one of the most important races in Japan.
Yeah, look, that was interesting. Coincidentally, I happened to be back in Tokyo that week. I'm probably about the only person in the world who isn't a journalist who heads back to Japan to watch elections. But I had some other things to do. But I was there for the election, the Tokyo election this time. And look, that was interesting. I mean, I was really interested in it because, of course, it was ostensibly between 2 women, Koike, the incumbent, and Renho, of course, with a long history in the Democrat side of politics in Japan. And for quite a while there, it was going to be, between those 2. And Renho, in the end, just got pipped by Ishimaru. And I'm glad we've come to this part of the conversation, because while I was there, what interested me is, how he sort of came out of nowhere, if you like. He came from another prefecture to come and stand as governor of Tokyo. Now, in Australia, for example, if you're not local to the area, we're not going to vote for you. What's this guy doing? Now, here he is. He sort of plonked himself and said, well, I'm going to, come and do this whole thing to Tokyo. And he had that appeal to young people. He did YouTube, his campaigning. So I often go around and watch a fair bit of the campaigning as these candidates go around. Was kind of dynamic. He was trying to make a point. I think he did something like 200 of the, speeches and campaign speeches around the traps. And he really, really stood out. Now, what struck me after that, now Renho was you could see was clearly devastated. I mean, this really came up, I think, and surprised everybody. But what I was thinking about afterwards, and I'm sort of putting together an article about it because I was quite fascinated in terms of how we run politics as a horse race almost, or how we ignore the important policy aspects for what's on show. Because Ishimaru, in the week or so afterwards, in all these interviews and so on, people started thinking, oh, hang on, how did this guy get so high up? How did he come second? He doesn't have a lot to say. He doesn't answer questions. He doesn't really have much in the way of policy. He just got himself up there in a kind of, social media frenzy. And people sort of thought, oh, well, that kind of looks okay, without really going more deeply into what he was about. Now, people knew who Koike was. People knew who Renho was. But here's this bright, new, shiny person who's come up that attracted people. Now, this is a direction I think that politics is taking that concerns me greatly. And it doesn't mean I want to stay in stodgy kind of old-time politics. But for me, this is where I'm sort of taking a step back from the day-to-day of politics to sit and think about what this actually means for our politics in future, and what do we as citizens actually, what we should be asking for, what we should be seeking from our politicians. They come and they want our vote, but in between the elections, in between the campaigns, what are they actually doing? Now, it seems to me that as a result of this in Tokyo, I mean, Ishimaru has himself, talking about sort of just throwing your head in the ring to see what comes next. He now wants to go and take on Kishida in Kishida's electorate in Hiroshima. Well, and he said in one of his press conferences, well, I'll just go and take on Kishida now, I mean, why not? And I just thought, politics is kind of not this sort of game. And we as citizens have just as much responsibility to make sure it doesn't become this sort of game that it seems to be coming. I mean, the Tokyo, other aspects of the Tokyo election, I know we're not talking about that greatly, but the number of candidates, the way the electoral laws were abused, the posters and things, it was just, if I wasn't actually there looking at it all, I wouldn't have believed it. It was just such a sad thing to see that politics, which is actually a noble profession, I might say, has become this. And to me, that's where my work is heading now, is to ask ourselves these really big questions about how can we do better. And it's not relying on politicians. They're simply our representatives. They're not great celebrities or anything. They're our representatives working for us. So how do we rekindle that, the importance of our relationship with politicians, that I guess I'll be working on in the near future.
Those are such important points. And I think we're thinking about that a lot in the American election as well. Not only who's the most popular, which is really important, but who can get things done, right? So when you look at these younger candidates, thinking back to when Koizumi was environmental minister and he was making a speech at COP, and it was very clear he didn't really have the autonomy to talk freely. And it made me really think, wow, who really has power about policy? It's not really the prime minister. It's not really the elected official who's talking often, right? So that was one of the things I thought when I was listening to Kishida, that it seemed like he did have more autonomy and freedom in how he was speaking with real conviction And you want that as the public, but is that someone who's going to make the right policies happen, which actually make a difference in your life? It's such a balance, right?
Yeah. Most certainly. And I think that's, I mean, in political philosophy, we have this idea of the social contract, which has been around for many, well, centuries, really. And I just think it's now time for us to rethink it. And this is where my work is moving towards now, because and particularly now in the sort of world that we're living in. I mean, a lot of the big issues, and I know that you talk about them on your program all the time, and I think I do just want to reiterate my congratulations to you on getting so many programs up. And I remember when you first started this, and I know that your work that you've done on this program has really made some fundamental changes in the way that I live, but also how I've taught my students in terms of what is sustainable. Now, climate change, sustainability, peace, these are not the preserve of any political party. This involves all of us. And this is why it's important for us now, whatever our age. We talk about young people disengaging from politics. Well, they're probably disengaging from this kind of, factional stuff that's coming up. It's only people like me who really have that much interest. We're sad people. But young people, it's climate change, it is sustainability, it is, both in Australia and Japan, the cost of living. The generations coming through after my generation, are in many ways doing it much harder. Now, traditional political parties aren't quite responding to that in the way that really they need to. And I think as voters, in Australia, voting is compulsory. Everyone must turn out to vote. And this was something I used to talk about with my students quite a lot in Japan. They don't have to. And I said, but because, and there was this sense that, well, my vote doesn't matter. I said, well, okay, if your vote doesn't matter, if you're not voting, what are you doing to try and get politicians to hear what you're saying? Do you go out and join, go and listen to their street campaigns during elections, when they're on top? No, why would I do that? I said, well, go out there, show that you're interested, so that they know that there are young people there. So some of my students, we would take them to some of those events and get them to speak to the politicians, just to change their minds a little bit. Not far from my campus in Ariake, when I was in Tokyo, every Constitutional Day, 3rd of May, which is a public holiday in Japan, one of the parks there was the site of probably the largest gathering of people who want to preserve Article 9 of the Constitution. And for most of your audience will know what that is, of course, but that's the critical article in the Constitution that says Japan won't go to war, that Japan will maintain peace and so on. And this is also critical in who becomes prime minister and all the rest, and recent Japanese political directions. But I took my students to that sometimes. I said, look, I know it's a public holiday and I know you don't want to come all the way down. But I said, look, it's just literally next door. Let's go and have a look. Let's go and see what people are doing in order to convey their views to politicians, not just on voting day, but what are we doing? It is up to us. Now, prior to COVID, that assembly got, I think, around about 70 or 80,000 people. Post-COVID, the last couple that I went to before I came home, was down on numbers, but social media expanded that quite a lot as well. So there is ways to engage the public in politics that take us just beyond these factional numbers and deals, and if we can get engaged in what that politics can be, as I said, it is important for things like climate change, for sustainability, for how do we, to implement all the things that you've been talking about and doing on your program over the years. That's politics as well, and how do we keep pushing that, and how do we make people our representatives. They're just our representatives. They're not, super untouchable figures. They shouldn't be. And that's what's really important. And I guess, over the years, sort of as a result of talking to you and working with you over the years and just rethinking what we can do with our politics, this is where my work is going now. That sure, it's important to know who the the Prime Minister is going to be, but how much of a role do we have in that, and what we should be doing, and how do we get that across and be much more engaged? Because some of these issues are just too big and too important to leave to politicians. It's one way I would put it to the students.
I appreciate everything that you're saying, Donna, so much. And it's been such a pleasure having you at events that I've tried to host, like Women Inspire, where we had all women speakers in rural areas as a way to revitalize. And we only did that for a year, but I would love to revisit that again someday. And it was great having you as a part of that. And I remember you saying how you were taking ideas from the shows that I was doing and trying to incorporate that in your classes. And one thing you said really stuck out about how at the beginning of the course, you'd have a lot of students with single-use PET bottles, and at the end, you didn't have any. And so you felt like there was a bit of progress there. That's great to hear. And I said before we started, I feel like these talks, including this one today, the Seek Sustainable Japan, is like a point in time in Japanese history. And we're talking about what the situation is now. And hopefully it's relevant years into the future as people look back and hear from experts like you about what's happening on different topics, which definitely connect to sustainability. So that's awesome to have you on. Why don't we talk about the next woman in the top 7? We haven't mentioned quite yet. Sanae Takaichi. Sorry, Sanae Takaichi.
Yeah, let's talk about Takaichi. Look, again, she's quite ambitious for herself. I mean, I think she's even perhaps positioned herself as Japan's Margaret Thatcher. Make of that what you wish. She's... It's almost very hard to use the word conservative these days when we talk about some of these quite radical right-wing people, I think. And again, this is again changes in politics. The left-right binary that we're in, the conservative progressive binaries that we find ourselves in, again makes politics out to be some kind of horse race kind of thing. All of us, I think, if we stop and consider our values, might have bits from there and bits from there and bits from there, and so do our politicians. The ones I've worked with, the ones I've known. But Takaichi is going very hard on a radical conservative program, if I can say. She would seek revision of the Constitution. She's very much a protege of Abe, and would continue down that track, I think. So she writes. She's had a couple of books. I think she's just about to publish another one, which people are seeing as her. A lot of politicians will publish books, whether they've written them or whether they're ghost written is another part of the story. I have a whole bookshelf here of politicians' books from the 1980s telling us all about their policies, and it's often a signal that this is what they would want to do if they became Prime Minister, lays out their policy platforms and things like that. And in the last presidential election here, I had Takaichi's book as well, and it's quite it would continue taking Japan down the Abe pathway, and whether or not people want. I know that's was Abe's directions were highly regarded with international partners, Australia for one, but there was a real disconnect with the Japanese population about going down that path. And I think this is what, might just keep her out of the race, because she's quite well known for being that very radical. I mean, if they were to choose a woman, the pragmatist in me would say they'd probably choose Kamikawa before they chose Takaichi, simply because of her very, as I say, radically conservative. Because she's not conservative. She wants to change lots of things, but very much on the right hand side of politics, I think. So again, she's in her 60s, and even with that has been elected 9 times. So back in the 80s and 90s, it was very easy to pick the next Japanese prime minister. It would usually be the number of elections they'd successfully stood for, the number of times they'd been elected. They usually had a path through the ministries, and it was kind of, well, it's your turn now. But these days it is a little bit different, and you do have to juggle. And the fact that members of the party outside the parliamentary party can have some input to the voting as well makes it really, juggling all balls. And out of that might come a compromise candidate that we don't know yet. It's quite interesting.
So it really seems like this is the week when a lot of candidates are making their announcements officially. So we're just guessing on who the top 7 possible candidates are. But we might be completely wrong. We might have missed someone, but these are likely going to be within these 7. Let's talk about Toshimitsu Motegi.
Okay, well, again, under the old LDP, Motegi is someone who would have anticipated that because of the career path he's taken through the party, it would be my turn at some point. And so, he's held some of the significant positions in the party. He's been, spokesperson at times. He's the one, as Kanjicho, as one of those significant positions in the party where he might try and pursue and push particular policies and so on. It's the positions he's held previously would be considered some of the significant, powerful positions in the LDP that, as the party president, the party leader, members of the party would have expected he would have had, which might edge him ahead of some of the others who've still only held positions at the ministerial level. To hold these 2 or 3 key party positions is often considered, really important as far as the experience goes, and what he can do. Again, I don't see many of these people like Motegi or Hayashi, who we might talk about as well, stepping out of that. I think the Abe influence is probably going to remain. We've seen with Kishida, he couldn't get out from under the Abe shadow. And, Abe changed the rules, from only having 2-year terms to extending that to first to 3-year terms, and then going beyond the 2-term limit to another term. I think for the foreseeable future, even amongst the candidates, aside from Ishiba, all of them will still be under the Abe shadow, I think, for some time to come. And it's going to take a lot to move out of that. And particularly I think, by next year, once the election comes around, that's about the time that Yamagami, I think, will be going to trial for the murder of Abe as well. So that's going to float up again, and people are going to have that sense of sympathy, I guess, is going to come out again. All those factors might come into it, and I think that might be used as well. So it's I just still feel that for better or worse, the shadow of Abe, people will want to continue his legacy. People will want to see that even though I think there was a point at which, just a few years ago, we might have pulled back a little bit from the very pro-military line that Japan was going down. Suga or Kishida might have been able to pull back, but I think the shadow of Abe, I think will keep things, in that direction for a few years yet.
Yeah, talking about Abe a little bit, you've probably got lots of insights. He really changed the party and Japanese politics. He's well remembered abroad. People often talk about him. He, is remembered as, I think, being next to Mario to accept the bid for Tokyo Olympics. Do you remember that scene? And
Yep.
so he had that kind of easygoing, kind of join in the fun side. But also he, is connected, even his murder is connected to the scandal, which Kishida is stepping down for people taking donations, especially from this church, which is maybe not really a church. And Kishida has worked hard to declassify that church, which is more like a cult, and telling people in the party to cut their ties. So, there's a lot of positive, but also negative about Abe's legacy, and definitely still connected to current politics, right?
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I have to say that it was Abe coming back, or the LDP regaining power in 2012, which actually got me thinking about, I probably need to get back to Japan to see what's going on now. I did, again, because I'm probably the only election tourist in the world. I did happen to be back in Tokyo to watch the 2012 election. Now, this, of course, was the very important one, was the one after the triple disaster in Tohoku. People were clearly disappointed with the way that, it was the Democratic Party in government, but people were so quick to blame them, led by Abe, I would say. His Nihon no Torimadosu, the slogan that they used for that particular election, let's take Japan back, had a double meaning. It was like, well, after this disaster, let's, pull Japan together again. And I still remember this, and I think this was the trigger that made me want to come back to Japan more long term. It took a few years to get back, but I eventually got back. We were sitting there, I was with my friends, and we were watching the press conference afterwards, after the election, after it was clear that, yes, indeed, the LDP were back in power in 2012. And it was about 11 o'clock at night, I think, his press conference. And he sat there and he said, well, now this gives us the mandate to change the constitution. And my friends and I said, did he just say what I thought he said? And my friends, who were not LDP supporters, I would say, said, yeah, where did that come from? Now, this was something that had not been spoken about in the election at all, and in any part of the campaigning. I thought, now there's something going on here. And of course, subsequent years, Abe's idea of Nihon no Torimadosu became quite clear. They went back to Meiji era leaders, the late 19th century, early 20th century leaders, when Japan was, becoming a big, power. And I thought, now this is going to be an interesting few years if Abe is able to see that through. So it was, in fact, that, I can't believe I remember these things, but it was, in fact, that particular press conference that made me think something is about to change in politics. And indeed, so from 2012 through to the present, and that's why we say, Abe's influence is going to continue. Now, we can't talk in hypotheticals very much either, but I mean, if he hadn't been shot, if he was still alive, certainly he may have come back to the leadership again himself, for a third time or some such. He probably would have maintained quite a strong factional power. And indeed, what's to say how much of this tie-up with the Korean religious group would have actually put him in, give him less influence is hard to say. But the fact that this all came to head once he was shot, once he was killed, and the way the party's tried to deal with that since, there's still a great skepticism in the public. But what that's actually has done is made the public more skeptical about politicians, and unfortunately probably back to, well, what's the point of following politics? Or, you know, these politicians aren't really listening to us anyway. So we're at a really interesting juncture, I think, in politics at the moment. I mean, as I was thinking about today's talk with you, I thought, you know, sometimes the beach cleans that we go and do, and we find those, I thought, what's the best way to explain this? You know, we find those fish nets, and they're just all tangled, and there's bits and pieces in them. I just feel that over the next few weeks, what I'll be doing is taking one of those great big balls of, you know, fish netting and so on, and trying to unpack it, because that's really kind of where we're at with this, given the overlay of the US presidential election as well. I mean, it's, you know, it's, for me, it is a fascinating time, but, you know, we can't necessarily put our predictions out there at this stage. You know?
Yeah. I've just asked the audience a question. Now it looks like we have a few people there. Which candidate do you think should be put into power as the next prime minister in Japan? It'd be interesting to hear your insights as well. Donna's got the very political scientist, I'm not going to make a prediction kind of theory here. I appreciate that as well, but it'd be fun to hear what the audience is thinking. Now there's one more that we haven't really covered, and he might be one of the front runners, Shigeru Ishiba. Can you talk about him a bit?
Well, Ishiba is kind of the candidate that I think a lot of people would like to have, because he's not, but he's kind of the LDP's internal critic. Some would go as far to say he's kind of the LDP's conscience at the moment. He's probably, again, in those who do you want as next prime minister polls that the newspapers do at the moment, he's probably generally tops that poll, interestingly enough. Now, he himself, you know, again, he's been elected 12 times or something, although interestingly he is a few years younger than Kamikawa. He's still only about 67, 68. He's held, again, the range of political roles and ministerial roles in the party that would have given him at another time a certain trajectory to become prime minister. Sometimes in the past, his, you know, again, he's a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. We can't get away from the fact that they all do have this conservative sheen about them. But, you know, in the 60s, 70s and 80s, when I was studying, you know, when I was looking at the party history, there's always been these two main streams within the Liberal Democrats, and it's often called the mainstream and the anti-mainstream, and it might be about relations with China or not China, or, you know, there's always been these, apart from all the myriad factions, they've always sort of coalesced in two sort of pro and anti views, and I guess that's what sort of keeps parties bubbling along a little bit. Now, Ishiba, look, it would be interesting to see him come in as prime minister. If he'd become prime minister, say, you know, 10 years ago, when I think he first sort of thought about becoming prime minister, you know, it probably would have been different. But I just get a sense in listening to his interviews and the way he comes across, he actually engages reasonably well in live television with the audience and so on, and you know, the question and answer sessions. And that's why he has this, he seems to have picked up over the years, I guess this sort of explains some of his popularity with the general public. Perhaps there's something that's come with age. I mean, I think when we all get a little bit older, we sort of reflect and think, well, how would I do things differently? I just get that sense that he would be a different prime minister now compared with what he might have been 10 years ago. And I think he might be, I think he's got enough experience, you know, having been elected, you know, 12 times, where, as we were talking earlier about Kishida having that problem trying to straddle the what I want to do versus what I must do. I think my sense is, just watching Ishiba quite closely over the last few years, he just might have that, what would you call it, a kind of a calming or a kind of a stabilizing of not being quite as radical as what Abe had planned, but not, being entirely conservative at the same time. So I think, to answer your question, do I who would I like out of this? Like, if ideally I'd like a woman, but we know that the politics of the world at the moment is not in favour of that. I think a young woman, Noda is another one whose political career I've followed quite closely. I guess of this current crop, if I wanted to feel that, what would you call it, almost like the safest pair of hands over the next couple of years, it would probably be Ishiba, surprisingly, because now he mightn't have the factional support, but getting back to my earlier comments about engaging the public again in politics, if he's sitting there with that sense, that people get that sense that he engages with them, that he's not doing it necessarily. Look, there's also all sorts of things or problems with Ishiba as well. I'm not going to say he's, no candidate is perfect, but just watching where politics needs to go, Japanese politics needs to go at the moment, and who could sort of just bring a little bit of stability to that element. I think probably Ishiba could possibly be the best candidate for now, I would think. There you go. You've done what I said I wouldn't do. You've made me pick somebody.
I love it. I love it. So we were talking a little bit before we went live about signaling, and I think this election is a lot about signaling, not only choosing who's going to be the president of the LDP now, who will be the prime minister, but it's really about the election next year.
Yep.
So they want to choose someone that the general public feels happy to back, because that means their party will stay in power, right? Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. This is interesting, because when a candidate presents himself or herself to the electorate, it's quite different from having to present herself or himself to the people in this instance who are going to elect him, which are, as we said, the factional leaders. It's the factional leaders, not so much the factional members. The factional members will be told who to vote for. But it's also just in the first stage of the voting that element of the local members out in the prefectures, and they get to have a proportional vote as well. So there is that. It's quite different from the election campaigning itself, where they're trying to appeal to people in their electorate. There is that balance between what sort of traditions do I bring, what sort of, will I be upholding the values of the Liberal Democratic Party, however we might want to decide what they are these days. Is it safe to go away from the Abe-influenced party? Can we convince people to think about coming and going down a different path at the moment? It's quite tricky while ever Abe's legacy remains. But that certainly there's that sense of amongst the various candidates of wanting to appeal to the broader electorate at this stage, because as you say, whoever wins this whoever's president becomes prime minister and will lead to the next election, which is scheduled for next year, but could of course be a little bit earlier. So again, speaking to my students over the last 8 years or so from teaching, they all have this sense that, well, the LDP only listens to the older people anyway, and it's only the silver, which a little bit of silver here, but I don't vote. It's very much a silver democracy, as a lot of students would talk about, that the LDP was really only appealing to those people, the older people who will vote. So whether or not Koizumi, Kobayashi can appeal to the younger people, get them to vote as well. That's remains to be seen. But they're all going to say, it's interesting that you said, Kamikawa's interests include Rajo Taiso. I think all of us, who have been park around 6:30 in Tokyo will see that sort of going, and that's got a kind of appeal, I guess, for some people. Koizumi coming out and saying he's in support of keeping your surname once you're married and so on. That is a really important issue for a generation as well. So it's hard, I guess, to try and sort exactly where the appeal should be. So yeah.
Well, that is our hour. That went way too fast, Donna. Thank you so much for joining and adding all of your amazing insights. We've got a couple comments. Darren on LinkedIn, thanks for joining. He says, I do like Koizumi's understanding of the importance of a circular economy. Yes, the understanding and the focus and the transparency about the need to balance environmental needs as well as economic needs is certainly something we want to hear more about. It's such a pressing issue. We're having yet hottest ever weather all over the world, including Japan, lots of environmental issues, right? Mr. Miyazaki, admitting I'm lost in Japanese politics since leaving the country in 2012. However, I also liked Mr. Koizumi. Yep. So I think it's true. Koizumi is hitting a lot of interest in international stage, as well as a lot of younger people who like his proposal, like you said, about keeping your name. Just like Harris Walls in America, the biggest issue is it's abortion and women's health care. There's a lot of issues about cost of living, which is really hitting, especially younger people, really hard in Japan. So it'll be really interesting to see how transparent and clear these electors or these candidates are in terms of what policies they intend to do. Are Japanese politicians usually forthcoming about that sort of thing, Donna?
Well, look, politics has to change. The candidates, it's the same here in Australia. They're pursuing the same old things that so many of our issues now are beyond party lines, and well, I don't even want to use the term savvy thinking politicians will engage their electorate and also, engage with the issues in a bigger way. I mean, party politics has become too professional, too much game playing, and I think, it's all comes down to numbers, and we've sort of put too much of the science into political science, and I want to bring back the political from political science. We've got to be much more political, and that means much more engaging, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity, because I don't often get a chance to speak for an hour, but it's this level of engagement that is actually really, really important, not what yesterday's opinion poll said. So my thanks to you, Joy, for this wonderful program that you have, and let's keep on doing it.
Yeah, and I'd love to follow up once we get closer to the election, or even after a candidate's chosen, and then talk about how it's changing in the party with the new president of the party, and how that's shaping Japanese politics. It's always kind of a moving goalpost, right? Thank you so much, Donna. It's been great having you on. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
And thank you very much.